Welcome to TYT's The Conversation. I am your host, Adrienne Lawrence, and today I bring you Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, professor at American University in Washington, D.C., where she directs the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, PERIL, in the Center for University Excellence. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Miller-Idriss.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome, super happy to have you, in part because you have extensive experience, 2 decades plus, researching radical and extreme youth culture. And your most recent book, Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, which just came out at the end of October, it seems so incredibly timely for right now. Why is that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I say that I used to study fringe subcultures in a country overseas where I spent really 20 years studying Germany, and all of a sudden the work that I was doing became much more mainstream. So it was not predictable, although I think the events over the last 4 years, 5 years in this country have made it a more predictable situation. So I'm not that surprised that we are where we are right now, although of course wish that I were not here talking to you with relevant expertise.
Wow, and we are glad to have you here despite the unfortunate circumstances. And to kind of flesh a little bit of that out more, it seems that it's rooted in toxic masculinity, that is the true driver in this far-right violence, both on and offline. But these hypermasculine traits that we now know to be toxic, they've seemed to always been present, underlying. So what is it that's really changed in our society that's made these traits so dangerous for us now?
Well, I think I'm so glad you asked that question because it so often doesn't come up in discussions of white supremacist extremism or anti-government extremism. Only recently, I feel like, have we started to connect more systematically these misogynistic male supremacist frameworks with white supremacist frameworks and anti-government frameworks. This idea of a threat, which unites all of them, and the ways in which a lot of these same groups pose the threat of anti-gender studies, anti-feminism, attacks on higher education for changes in kind of transgender rights or transgender bathrooms. I mean, there's just pronoun usage. There's a whole host of cultural changes around gender that get attacked. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of this toxic masculinity now, also often directed toward women. So connections to domestic violence and gender-based violence are also very high across these movements. But those dots are still not connected often enough, either in the national level or the global level.
Which is, it seems very easy for me to see in terms of something I do on Twitter often is show the handshake between racism and sexism as these ideologies are aligned in terms of really pushing out otherness. So it is still a shock to me that people are not connecting these dots. But it also seems that there's definitely been that uprising in this male-focused hate group area called the Boogaloo Boys. And then we have the incels and Proud Boys, and they all seem to be very North American focused, if not centered in the United States. And I know you have a lot of experience studying this abroad and in the United States. So can you tell us why the US is so vulnerable to hosting these toxic masculinity groups?
Yeah, we've seen a big rise of the toxic masculine groups and the intersections. And one of the things I want to say is I think you're absolutely right that what we're seeing here are parallel hierarchies of superiority and inferiority that kind of connect across white supremacy, male supremacy, Christian supremacy, all of those kinds of dehumanizing ideologies and things that position one group as better or superior to others. And so it's like they have the similar kind of scaffolding and one allows an expansion into the other domains, I think, in ways that eases that transition or creates a kind of overlap between them. So we have seen a 320% increase in right-wing terror globally. It is a global issue, and the gender-based violence part of that is also global. And I think that's really important to mention. But in the US, you're absolutely right. There's been a big upsurge in these kind of male supremacist and incel groups, as well as the chauvinist, Western chauvinist groups that are men's rights only, like the Proud Boys. And so we're seeing it, and I think it's hard not to connect that to the hyper-masculine narratives and language coming across from this administration and from the president himself. Although it's also really important to note that the roots of this are started far before this administration. So I think there's been a normalization and mainstreaming in this administration, but we were seeing, the incel violence against women before this administration came in.
And you say that the roots of this started far before this administration. And of course, in my limited knowledge, I can't help but guess, is this a part of the fact that we have this westernized white culture where we essentially lie to people in our education system and tell them how great they are and how great essentially the American people are without giving the full-fledged truth? So I'm wondering, what are the roots there? Please tell us.
Yeah, again, the education, the lack of critical education, the lack of critical histories. I mean, that is changing, but there's so much tension. Anytime a critical history is introduced, anytime the narratives that I was taught in my generation, that children are still taught today about Thanksgiving, about Native American histories, right? These kind of kind references are very deeply rooted, and so it gets much harder to disentangle those violent histories and acknowledge with some kind of humility where we are today and where those roots have been.
Wow, it's unfortunate to really see all of this culminate and come forward, especially because it poses such a threat to the physical safety and well-being of so many of us. And one of the newer groups, definitely that still makes me go, who? Is the Boogaloo Boys, and forgive me if I'm not saying that correctly, but they seem to intersect so much with your work. And what is it about these new groups that really allows them to latch on to a base?
Boogaloo is a really interesting example because it started as a joke and online with teenagers, and even I've seen patches that they use calling themselves a meme-based insurgency. It's really more a mobilizing idea than it is a group. It refers to civil war or insurgency, and it gets layered onto other groups like a hashtag, and that makes it really popular for a wide range of groups who want to advocate for revolution or civil war or violent insurrection and rise up against what they see as a tyrannical government. But it can be tagged on to the Proud Boys. It can be tagged onto a militia group. It can be, it has intersections with a whole range of them. So it's less like a movement than it is an organizing idea. And I think that's part of how it has spread so quickly across social media, like a contagion or a virus, because it's an idea that can just get layered on or added to something else.
Wow, that's very scary because we also know how powerful ideas are and how quickly they can spread. And so I know something that you recently wrote for CNN in explaining that COVID-19, the lockdowns have brought a lot of high-level anxiety, depression, social isolation to teens, making it more likely that they could be vulnerable to this perfect storm of extremism. So how can we balance this volatility to teens yet keep everyone safe?
Well, I think the first thing, a lot of parents and caregivers who are really on the front lines now, you don't have as many teachers interacting with kids in person or coaches or employers or the parents of friends who might be able to spot those kinds of warning signs. So parents and caregivers really need to be alert to watching out for the kind of language that teens are using. What have they been exposed to? Are they talking about conspiracy theories? Are they circulating an anti-Semitic claim about the virus or its origins or an anti-Asian claim? Right? What's going on and where did they hear it? And use that as an opening to find out what's going on. But also I think it's really critical to interrogate some of these histories of race and inequality and injustice in this country that get exploited and used. And that there's no coincidence here that we saw mobilization around the Black Lives Matter movement in particular this summer. And I think, when white parents in particular take kind of colorblind approaches to not having conversations with their kids about race or inequality, it leaves open all the online discourse, that someone else just explains. They think that what's going on to them, and leaves them with scapegoating and propaganda and misinformation instead of conversations from the roots and ground up within their families.
Wow, and I'm also wondering too, and maybe you've covered this in your book, which I think could be very interesting for a number of people out there. But what is the connection with these? Essentially these far-right groups and also the school shootings that go on that we've fortunately had some reprieve from by virtue of the fact of unfortunately having, the coronavirus lockdown?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're seeing there is just the very quick mobilization to violence among young people, and of course the easy access to weapons, which is one of the things that makes the US unique compared to other countries in this regard. But you also see the kind of the toxic online communities that celebrate. So we know that whenever there's a school shooting, there's a high risk of a copycat shooting, that there is a kind of contagious effect to this. And the same thing happens with racist or misogynistic violence, where they take kind of inspiration or even live stream these attacks to get notoriety and supposedly inspire followers. And I think there are a lot of overlaps there that haven't been adequately explored.
Well, hopefully somebody definitely does that exploration, and hopefully it will come to an end. Thank you so much for joining us. And can you please tell us where they can find you and Hate in the Homeland?
Yes, they can find Hate in the Homeland either at Princeton University Press's website, on Amazon.com, and at american.edu/peril, PERIL is our lab, our research lab.
Fantastic. Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.